In June of 1976, the British Isles were subjected to a massive heat wave. The peak temperature recorded in Cheltenham on July 3rd was 35.9 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that temperature would be 96.6 degrees. That summer would be one of the driest, sunniest, and warmest summers of the 20th century. In a small room with an open window, 3 men were recording the most boundary-pushing music of that era, capturing the paranoia and insanity that defined the Cold War and influencing countless bands thereafter. The name of this band was The story of this heat starts with the band Quiet Sun. Formed by college friends Phil Manzanera, Bill McCormick, and Charles Hayward in 1970, the outfit was part of the Canterbury progressive rock scene. The band wouldn't last long, however, breaking up in 1972. Manzanera had obligations to another band as the guitarist of Roxy Music. Hayward, the drummer, placed an ad in Melody Maker in 1973, looking for a guitarist and bassist to audition in one of his own projects. Among many other talented musicians who answered the ad, guitarist Charles Bolan arrived and the two of them hit it off. A few months later, the two Charles Sy, met at another gig and decided to form a duo, starting rehearsals in Hayward's childhood home. They named themselves Dolphin Logic. Eventually, the duo would join another band named Radar Favorites. There, they would meet their manager Gareth Williams. Williams had no experience playing music but had a penchant for strange sounds, a perfect contrast to Bolan and Hayward being multi-instrumentalists. In an interview Hayward did with the Quietus, he said, "Sometimes it would just be down to him playing one note on a keyboard for 12 minutes and slowly manipulating all of these effects pedals, making music out of just a single note. It was a refocusing of what technique was. Instead of andante or legato, it would be angry or stumbling over." In 1975, Bill McCormick and Hayward got a call from Manzanera. He was recording his first solo album and had just enough time and budget to finally have Quiet Sun record an album themselves. The resulting record, Mainstream, is emblematic of the Canterbury scene and provides a shining example of Hayward's drumming. Fortunately for the band, Mainstream was able to reach the bottom of the top 30, as Hayward described it, and the band was going on tour to support it. One caveat, however, Manzanera couldn't make it. He had more obligations with Roxy Music and could only make the first 2 gigs and sporadically as a guest. Again left without a guitarist, Hayward and McCormick had to make a replacement, and so they brought in Charles Bolan. By this point, Hayward was well experienced with prog rock and wanted a change, akin to the work he was doing with Bolan in Radar Favorites and Dolphin Logic. He suggested bringing in Gareth Williams as singer, and Williams auditioned, and McCormick and Williams hate each other. After this, McCormick pieces out, leaving only Bolan, Hayward, and Williams. The Quiet Sun reform fell through, breaking the band up for a second time. At the same time, Williams went off to study history of art at Cambridge, leaving the future of the band uncertain. This especially wasn't a good time because the band had gotten an offer to gig at the Three Horseshoes in Hampstead on February 13th, 1976. With their one opportunity dangling in front of them, Hayward wrote a letter to Williams to convince him to come back. It might not have worked if not for one line in the letter that was ingeniously enticing. Why study art when you could be making it? Using Theseus logic, Hayward, Bolan, and Williams decide to give themselves a new name to reflect this new band, one that emphasizes experimentation and being outside the bounds of regulation. They call themselves Friendly Rifles. And then the Sex Pistols happened? Yeah, they couldn't use Friendly Rifles anymore, so they switched the name to This Heat, referencing the 1976 British Isles heatwave. In 1976, however, the heat wasn't only coming from the sun. The Doomsday Clock is a symbol for how likely humanity is going to end its own existence, created and maintained by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Every year, the Bulletin considers the global, political, and environmental climate and decides how close we are to blowing ourselves up by setting the time to a certain amount of minutes to midnight, with midnight being the end of the world. They created the clock in 1947 in response to the onset of nuclear weapons and the existential threat they posed to civilization, setting the initial time to 7 minutes to midnight. Fast forward to 1970 when Quiet Sun was formed, and the current clock says it's 10 minutes to midnight. When Quiet Sun breaks up for the first time, the clock is moved back to 12 minutes. The Cold War seems to be thawing a bit between the United States and the Soviet Union. The SALT I and ABM treaties are agreed to, and relations improve. It's looking up for the world. This is the farthest back the Doomsday Clock will be set for 9 years. A year before Quiet Sun releases mainstream, the clock is set at 9 minutes, owing to India's first successful nuclear weapon test and SALT II talks stalling. The world is inching closer to destruction, a losing scenario for everyone, no matter who launches first. Lyrically, this heat's focus is on the paranoia that at any moment, everything you know and love can evaporate in an instant. Over almost every song in their discography is an aura of doom as the world marches to its end. Their music depicts a world made unrecognizable by destruction, and their reality was getting closer and closer to one of insanity. This heat adopted a motto that guided their music and described the intense zeitgeist of the era. All possible processes, all channels open, 24 hours alert. But for now, that's off in the future. They have to release their music first. The band, now sticking with the name This Heat, recorded their demo in 1977. According to their new manager, David Cunningham, they were, quote, very kind of mean about their tapes and very protective as opposed to everyone else who wanted to be heard, end quote. Their real target was legendary radio DJ John Peel, who was much more open to boundary-pushing music than the other DJs. Bullen and Hayward's recollections are inconsistent for how incessant their calling was, but in any case they got John Peel to listen to the demo so they would get off his back. This was apparently an effective strategy, because he liked the demo so much that he invited the band for a session that would be broadcast in April of 1977, and then for another session at the end of the year. Said Peel, "I get asked to play more music like This Heat, but to my knowledge there is no other music like This Heat." Soon, Cunningham would move into a new artist space repurposed from a meat pie factory in Brixton, convincing This Heat to set up studio space there. The band picked a once refrigerated meat locker as their space, ironically calling it cold storage. Over time, they would transform the former meat locker into a near-professional studio, spending time there nearly every day from when they first arrived to when they broke up. Using tapes recorded at Hayward's house, cold storage, and other professional studios, and aided by a host of engineers, This Heat began to record the boundary-pushing music they've been rehearsing for years. Finally, I get to talk about the sonic characteristics that made This Heat, This Heat. The easiest summarization and grossest oversimplification I can use to describe This Heat's sound is a combination of tape music with live instrumentation. This Heat provided a parallel to the punk music that exploded in 1976, rebelling against tired sounds and rock and systemic oppression, but in a manner separated from the general punk scene. Coming from progressive rock backgrounds, Bowen and Hayward brought the technicality, while the inexperienced Williams brought a freshness to the band unhampered by how music is supposed to sound. They were sparse in their instrumentation, but maximalist in their effect, focusing on the feeling rather than the theory. I think of the music in This Heat's discography as existing in a spectrum between two extremes, Mode A and Mode B, as I like to describe them. Mode A is pure chaos. Sounds and tones attack the listener at almost lightning speed, being almost analogous to Charlie Parker's solos if Charlie Parker played dissonant free jazz instead of bebop. The playing is either completely divorced from rhythm or just barely hanging on. However, the noise never becomes overwhelmingly loud, always remaining at a premeditated limit. Mode B is more subtle and sinister, almost exclusively using drones, ambient recordings, and slow, repeated riffs. It places the listener in a trance and creates a soundscape to get lost in. This Heat plays with this spectrum, taking aspects from either extreme and placing the concepts and how they play different parts. They could switch modes on a dime, or have a drone or prolonged note aligned with Mode B, accompanying speedy and frantic playing aligned with Mode A. This system is an approximation for how these songs are composed, but you need a new system when describing music like this. I'm not using regular music theory terms to describe the composition or sound of This Heat, because there is no adequate way to use conventional terms to describe a wholly unconventional band. Bolin, Hayward, and Williams separated themselves entirely from normal rock staples, such as a defined structure, chord progressions, or even a scale. These elements sometimes resurface, almost as if the music has a small moment of lucidity. Aside from these brief passages, this heat captures the paranoia of their reality and the insanity of nuclear Armageddon in music that is most certainly unhinged. These hallmarks of this heat's sound would all be present in their self-titled debut record, commonly called Blue and Yellow, released in 1979. Most of the songs here are passive, lurking in the background but terrifying all the same. Using our system from before, Blue and Yellow sits mostly in mode B, but this can change on a dime. The album starts and ends with Test Card, a single ultra-high organ note that stretches and breaks under the pressure, sounding akin to a computer going haywire. And then wham! You're hit with Horizontal Hold, a multi-sectional Frankenstein's monster of a song serving as a musical jump scare. Hayward and Bolin display their technical mastery of their instruments, and Williams makes the electronics bend to his will, giving the impression of a control room panicking. If you heard anything from this band, it's probably this song. Following Horizontal Hold is Not Waving, a hauntingly beautiful track with the lyrics and title being partially taken from the poem Not Waving But Drowning by British poet Stevie Smith. The lyrics detail a self-induced drowning over long droning notes and riffs, at points sounding like a classical piece. The lyric There Is No Tomorrow is a dark mirror to the no future attitude of punk music at the time, especially because this album was released months after Sid Vicious passed away, although it was recorded long beforehand. Fittingly, Water is next on the track list, serving as an instrumental transition with percussive sounds slowly coalescing into a terrifying din. Twilight Furniture is the last song on the first side of the record, the lyrics depicting informational lockdown and surveillance in wartime over tribal drumming and trance-inducing single notes. Closing out side A is more classical instrumentation, almost like an orchestra playing on a sinking ship, keeping the passengers entertained as they enter oblivion. Flipping over the record, we start with 24-track Loop, which is proto-90s British electronic dance music. I am not kidding. The idea stemmed from Bolin's guitar getting stolen. To get around this Heat recorded one of their jam sessions and looped the ending bars again and again through various effects. This track is rightfully lauded for its innovation, especially considering how Britain fell in love with jungle music in the 90s, which sounds eerily similar to 24-track Loop. I'd like to remind you all that this album was recorded more than a decade earlier, before the technology making this stuff widespread even existed.
What sorcery is this?
After blowing the collective mind of everyone who bought this record, the album heads into the 3-track stretch of Diet of Worms, Music Like Escaping Gas, and Rainforest. This is the closest that this Heat ever got to recording a horror movie soundtrack. From the ear-splitting tones in Diet of Worms to the slow riffs of Music Like Escaping Gas, to the musical release of Rainforest, these are the scariest songs on the album and exemplify how good the band was at creating soundscapes. Rainforest transitions into the last real song of Blue and Yellow, The Fall of Saigon, featuring sludgy tape loops as a backdrop to nonsensical lyrics detailing the fall of humanity's morals through eating a cat named Soda, as one would. The song was inspired by Hayward watching the actual Fall of Saigon on TV, before the station switched to regional news, which included a story of a whiskey-drinking cat named Soda. It furthers the themes of nuclear paranoia. It ends with a familiar note crescendo. The rest of the instruments fade out, leaving only the note from Test Card, which closes the album. The Fall of Saigon is a teaser for the more song-oriented format for the next album, more widely known and venerated, and also their last. But first, we've got an EP to cover. In 1980, this Heat released the Health and Efficiency EP, featuring the song of the same name in graphic/vari-speed, essentially chords being played for 11 minutes. Health and Efficiency is probably the happiest song this Heat ever made, a song dedicated to the sunshine and inspired by the members' biking trips. All of the hallmarks of this Heat's music are here, and it feels like a culmination of their work. It's a nice change of pace from the horror of Blue and Yellow, and a lighter tone is a welcome distraction from the doom hanging over everyone's heads. Hey, speaking of Doom, how's the Doomsday Clock holding up? It's been a while since we checked in on it. Oh. Oh no. This Heat released their next album, Deceit, in September 1981, 8 months after Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. Reagan, who released the famed record Ronald Reagan Speaks Out Against Socialized Medicine, this isn't a joke, by the way, you can find it on YouTube, wasn't one for negotiating with the Soviets to reduce the risk of nuclear Armageddon. He wanted to win the Cold War. Reflecting this, the Doomsday Clock reached 4 minutes to midnight in early 1981. The fear that was once abstract on the last record was finally defined as the fear of losing everything in a flash. Sleep begins the album as the closest this Heat ever got to a pop song, a lullaby written by the Boogeyman which serves as a critique of consumerism, making the public blind to the world's problems. Following this is another well-known song from the band, Paper Hats. Taken from a British term for an incompetent person, it's the only song with lyrics penned by Gareth Williams. Anguished screams and your Gregorian chanting trade off over a steady beat before exploding into a chaotic climax, ending with a steady outro that gets progressively worse in audio quality. It's a perfect contrast to Horizontal Hold from the previous album, displaying how the songs in Deceit fit more the Mode A part of the spectrum, while still retaining the abstract and sinister sound. Triumph feels like a victory song for someone who doesn't deserve it, a sludgy dirge with kazoos while the lyrics describe a power structure between seen and not seen, as Hayward wrote in the liner notes for the album's reissue. And then we reach the banger that is SPQR, a fast-paced punk thrash referencing the fall of the Roman Empire and linking it to humanity's perilous position over the end of the world. Our collective empire, so to speak. Humanity's unconscious collective reverts back to Roman ideals of conquest and groupthink, despite our progress. We are all Romans. Closing out the first side, Cenotaph is emblematic of the more song-focused format Deceit follows. The abstract fear that permeated the self-titled debut is solidified into a very present threat, with comparably stable drumming and a defined structure. Lyrically, it deals with never-ending war, sardonically singing, "A war to end all war," and the war that came after that. Flipping over the record, the song Shrink Wrap uses the same beginning tones that started Sleep, as well as the same drum loop, but now in the context of almost parodying Remain in Light by Talking Heads, which was released a year earlier. It mirrors the anti-consumerist lyrics of Sleep, but now focusing on how the rich exploit the labor of the poor through dangling a new product in front of them, wrapped in shrink wrap. Following Shrink Wrap is Radio Prague, one of the few songs on Deceit that emulates the sound on the debut, featuring a constant pulse combining with a radio program coming in and out of focus. We then get to my favorite song on the record, Makeshift Swahili. The lyrics detail a communication breakdown in the wake of nuclear Armageddon, where uneducated people can only communicate in primitive ways, a la Tower of Babel. The writing is especially relevant today with the rise of the internet. To illustrate what I mean, me saying the phrase "Baby Gronk Riz" has caused some of you confusion and has caused others to cringe. Listening to the song is like watching music fall apart as the audio quality worsens and the structure disintegrates. Independence is, quite literally, reading the Declaration of Independence. That's strange. I wonder what the United States has to do with overarching themes of nuclear destruction. The last real song in the album is A New Kind of Water, and it's the only song that Charles Bullen wrote the lyrics for. Every theme on the album is laid out in plain comprehension in this song, like they're venting every fear they have over the instrumental. It's like realizing that humanity is willingly choosing to have a drive towards death. Nobody wants to make the world a better place because it either takes too much work or goes against their own interests. The superpowers wanted to make more weapons despite knowing how destructive they are. It's a cathartic release of unbridled anger. The second half of the song is the most cohesive songwriting the band ever did. A final moment of lucidity before the world blows up, most likely because someone tripped and pushed the button. It's abruptly interrupted with this Heat's final song, Hai Bakusho, or Suffer Bomb Disease, a soundscape depicting a wasteland, the aftermath of the nuclear apocalypse. Just as suddenly as it starts, it ends. By Deceit's release in 1981, Williams had left the band to study the lifetime art of Kathakali, a form of classical Indian dance. For the 1981-82 tour, Bolan and Hayward brought on bassist Trevor Conway and keyboardist Ian Williams, but it just wasn't the same without Gareth. Fittingly, being formed after the end of a tour, This Heat officially broke up in 1982 after the end of their own tour. In December 2001, the three members began to rehearse for a potential reunion, perhaps another record. That same month, Gareth Williams died of cancer at 48 years old. He was survived by his partner Nick Goodall, who took the photograph on the cover of Deceit. On February 13, 2016, the band This Is Not This Heat took the stage at Cafe Otto in London, featuring Bolan and Hayward back together on the 40-year anniversary of This Heat's first gig. Joining them were multiple guests inspired by This Heat's work, including Sonic Youth's Thurston Moore and Hot Chip's Alexis Taylor. Bolan and Hayward would continue touring until 2019, leading to the band's final breakup. They both remain musically active. This Heat translated the paranoia of nuclear war into music. Their experimentation in sound influenced countless bands, and despite their work's initial releases not being commercially successful, their impact far outshone their profits. There was no greed in the way of their creativity, no corporate interests. It was just three men creating music in an old meat locker that encapsulated the zeitgeist of the late 70s and early 80s. Their sound and lyrics are even more relevant today, as the world seemingly teeters on destruction every other week. Every moment that the world's superpowers sit on top of civilization-ending weapons while ignoring our warming planet, the intensity of this heat will only increase.